Hello and welcome to Indian NO. I am your host, Genie V, and we are going to be talking about something that may seem a little bit different from our typical topic, but I do think it is something that many of us wonder about. We're going to be talking about caste and how within the American society we kind of break up into these groups, or we are put into groups. And for those of us who are neurodivergent, so many of us have experienced the caste that we've been assigned. So that's going to be our topic. Before I get into introducing my guest, just want to introduce a little bit about me. I am a transgender woman, and I am in a black patterned dress. My shoulders are visible. The background is blurry on purpose because I have just moved my adult son in with me, and we're still trying to find a place for everything. Now, I want to introduce my guest because this is somebody that I have grown to admire, somebody that I respect, somebody that I love. Nzinga, we are so glad to have you on Indian NO.
I am very, very happy to be here, and I'm just thankful that you feel that way about me because same.
Can you provide just a little bit of a physical description of you and your environment for those who may have difficulty seeing?
Yes, absolutely. So I am a Black woman. My pronouns are she and her. I am currently sitting in my living room / open concept dining room with a mirror behind me. I have on a long sleeved gray sweatshirt. And yeah, that's about it, I think.
Some of the most amazing, beautiful hair and captivating eyes. So I just had to throw that in, okay? Now, I like to do a warm-up question. This has absolutely nothing to do with the subject, but something just to help us kind of get into just being normally conversational. Your username, the name that you have, is very different from many of us who are, in particular, North American, European influenced. Nzinga, where does that come from?
So Nzinga is actually a queen. So Queen Nzinga is a historical figure that was a ruler over Angola, and she was an absolute badass. She actually fought against the slave trade, against the Portuguese. She fought against it with really her own people. But she was the one and only, I believe she was actually the only queen that was recognized by the English monarchy at the time. But there is a story of when she met with the English queen at the time, whose name I literally cannot remember right now because it was probably Elizabeth. They're all fucking Elizabeth. But anyways, but she walks into the room and the queen was sitting on her throne and there was no chair for Nzinga to sit on. So she actually had two of the men that were with her lay out as if they were a chair, and she sat on them. And it was kind of like the power play of, you think you're more powerful than me, but this is the loyalty that I have for my people. And just Queen Nzinga is a story that I heard about later on in life that I wish I had known when I was a little girl, because I just related to the fight so much, but also the power that she had was just, and it's amazing, like just an awesome historical figure.
And I love to listen to you tell it, just because, especially when you get to the part where Nzinga, orders some of her servants to sit down on the chair. You get this voice of power that is like, yes.
Yeah, oh man, it's just, I wish I had known about the story of Nzinga as a little girl. I feel like I probably would have moved through my life a little bit differently earlier. Because when I did hear about her, I was like, man, this is totally me. Like, I'm like, was I a warrior in a past life? I don't know. Like, I have a lot of fight in me, but I related to it in a very, yeah, like, we're fighters and we are powerful. And her entire story, like, I always tell people to look up the story of Nzinga because the entire story is absolutely wild, and some of the shit that she endured is absolutely horrific, and yet she came back and kept fighting, and it's just like,
It is awesome. Thank you for sharing that. We do like to talk about neurodivergence, and I'm just curious, what has been your journey of discovering neurodivergence, and sort of how does that play a part in your well-being?
So it's really interesting because as a little girl, so when I was 16, I was actually diagnosed with depression. And that was like the main diagnosis. And my therapist at the time was just kind of like, and actually a psychologist, my psychologist at the time was just kind of like, there might be something else going on here, but whatever, you know, and I never got tested because my parents were kind of like, my brother was immediately labeled with having ADHD, which it's like every single black boy in the 80s, it was like they have ADHD and they were just treated like absolute crap, like you can't learn, right? And with me, it was like, we're not going to have her labeled that way because I was a good student. So I was always a good student. I was always really focused in on my studies. I always got my stuff done. So they never even thought to take that, like, hey, there's something else going on here and get me tested. And it's just, it's really interesting because later on in life, when I talked to another therapist and they're like, yeah, no, like you definitely have ADHD. I was like, you know, I kind of thought so for a while. And I said it to my mom, and my mom was like, no, you don't. You don't have ADHD. And I had to have a conversation with her where I was like, you know, it's really interesting because I feel like in a lot of Black households, especially with Black boys, there is a bit of trauma around the diagnosis. So they don't understand, like, no, it doesn't have to look the same way for everyone. And it's not something that's necessarily bad. Like, because I have ADHD, I had learned a ton of stuff when I was younger because I would get hyper focused on things, right?
Yeah.
I am insanely organized because that is how I've always fought around my ADHD. But it was just really interesting, like having that conversation with her where it was just like, hey mom, like it's not a bad thing. Like, do you think it's a bad thing? Do you see something in me that's bad? And she was just like, no, and also it explains why you just dance in the living room randomly. And I was like, see, I'm just fun. I'm just fun. That's all. I'm just fun.
Exactly. That kind of gets us into kind of what I wanted to speak with you about, because we've had conversations about this, in very limited ability. This time I wanted to really kind of get into this conversation of the subject of caste with you, and talk about your perception of it, my perception of it, the perception of it as it relates to many of the different ways that we may not grasp that. So thank you for turning me on to the book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. It's a great book. It speaks directly to the experience of Black people in America in a comparison with the caste system in India. Is that correct?
So I would actually broaden it a little bit. I think that it compares Black, Indigenous, and Brown people specifically. Like even the history it goes over, it kind of encompasses all non-white or people who believe themselves to be white. It encompasses all of those groups and
Mm-hmm.
how it relates to the caste system in India and how um you know, it's really funny because like Americans could look at the caste system in India and they're just like, that's wrong, but they don't recognize the caste system that exists within the United States.
Right. So I have sort of my observation and how I've analyzed it. Can I hear your observation and how you see the caste system in the United States from your perspective?
So, from my perspective, I
Mhm.
think the caste system is kind of a ranking system of how much we don't like people. If that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
that's a simple way of putting it. It's like how much do we not freaking like you? How much do we want to other you? How much are your differences visible that we can use this as a means to keep more power and control people even more? That is my version of caste, right? I feel like even if you read the book is going to give you kind of a different view of it, but that is kind of how I view it. So it is literally a ranking system of one to infinity of white cisgendered heterosexual white male at the very top. And
Mm-hmm.
then at the very bottom, historically, Black women lie at the very bottom of the caste system.
Yeah.
And we've had conversations about that where I think that there's a chance that some of that may be moving around a little bit.
Right.
But it's essentially it's a non-spoken ranking system of most human to subhuman. That's the best way I could put it.
And that's, I mean, that is the point of the caste system in India. And Isabel Wilkerson goes into talking about how even from the philosophical roots of of the creation of the people who become Indian, the idea of being those who were almost superhuman, all the way down to the undesirables, as they are called now, and the untouchables and the subhuman. And I completely agree that that ranking is in place. And this is something that I began to notice all the way back in college when I was first looking at world civilizations and the comparisons of social systems. And it's like, there was this itch in the back of my head. It's like, why does the US have this system where everybody has its own little, they have their own little, block that they belong to? And I've been kind of, it's in the back of my head all along that it's there. And because you brought this to my attention, it sort of connected and it all began to fall into place. When did you begin to think that the caste system was applicable to your experience?
Oh man. So it's really interesting because I tell people all the time, I'm like, when I read something that is critical race theory, or if I read something from an anti-racism educator, or if I listen to anti-racism educators, I get validation from thoughts that I was always having. I get validation and I get language to things that I always knew to be real and to exist, right? So it's really interesting because for me, I think I have quite often pondered the question why people hate us so much. And being a child, like I'm really trying to think about the first time I even asked myself that question. And I feel like core memories, right? So I read The Diary of Anne Frank when I was in third grade. I'm going to say like I was like 8 years old and I read The Diary of Anne Frank. And that for me was a very big core traumatic. I read the damn book and it traumatized me as a kid to the point that I would sit around and think, how could another human being do this to another human being, right?
Right.
So I was asking myself those questions at 8 years old, like literally at 8 years old. I was sitting down, like, I don't understand why humanity could do this. And as I got older, I feel like the question became, why do people hate me so much? And like, I know you saw one of my TikTok videos, there was another creator who asked that exact same question. And this is a question that I think a lot of people who feel the oppression start asking themselves very young, right? So it's not so much as like, I feel like I always kind of knew it was there, but when I read the book, and I read the book like, I mean, it was years ago. I don't even know how old I was. I was in my 30s. I could say that much. But like when I read the book, I got the language. So it was like reading the book gave me, hey, this is what you've been experiencing. So the thing that you're kind of in the back of your head, like, what is this? What is this thing? You see this thing every single day. You see how people are treated differently every single day. And even when you're in groups of marginalized people, you see how even those marginalized people are treated differently depending on who else is in the group, right? So I've always seen that. And then reading the book, I was just like, oh yeah, that's exactly what it is. You know, like it gave me the language.
and this is the conversation that you and I get into fairly repetitively, is that context of marginalization.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems, I mean, I do not want to diminish the racial inequities and the harm that has been done to non-white people, because white power has controlled too many lives and has damaged too many groups of people.
Mm-hmm.
That is pure and simple.
Mm-hmm.
But laying alongside of that a concept of caste, we also begin to see that there is a broader understanding of the hierarchies,
Mm-hmm.
that even within each individual group, whether it is the power group or the marginalized group, there is also a hierarchy. And I mean, what is your take on that?
I 1000% agree with that. I think that, and like we've had this conversation before. So even within the hierarchy where Black women are supposed to be at the bottom, I feel like Black trans women are probably below Black women at this point, or Black cisgendered women at this point, because at the end of the day, the caste system is a made up system. It is someone who got some power, who said, okay, well, these people are dirt, so now I'm going to do all the propaganda around that. I'm going to do all the marketing around that. I'm going to create a story of who these people are, so that is so strong. It's so strong that the rest of the world will ignore what they see right in front of their faces, right? So, that's like the guy that I told you where it was like, Black people don't like dogs, as I was literally petting his fucking dog. Like, it's stuff like that, right? So it's interesting because within that caste system, you always have people who are fighting to keep their spot slightly higher. So, and specifically when I think about this, I think about Black men who are fighting certain advances with Black women, or like certain stereotypes where they lean into patriarchy a lot more because they are higher than Black women because they have maleness, right? And then when you think about like in which is like a huge issue within the Black community, but like when you think about trans Black women, and how there are a good number of Black women who are fucking terse, and I will never understand it. Like I remember being on Facebook and I was just like arguing with people and deleted some people off of Facebook when Tampax changed their fucking symbol. Like, I don't even know for sure if it was Tampax or if it was Playtex or whatever the fuck the brand is, but nobody pays attention to the symbol at all. And then all of a sudden you had all these people who are just like, why are they changing my symbol and blah blah, they don't need to be like, that's not a woman, blah. And it was like, it doesn't make any fucking sense. Like it does not make literal logical sense. And when you look at the empirical data to certain things, it makes even less sense. So weird. It's, and that's caste at work, right? Where it's like, I bought into the propaganda and I'm so afraid to lose my place because I've been told that, hey, as lowly as you are on this system, you still have this amount of power. You've been told that, and I'm so afraid to lose my place that now I'm trying to say that a trans woman is a threat to my woman. Like, how the fuck does that even happen? It does not make logical sense.
Right. And this has been my experience in my transition, that I held the highest seats in the castes, white, masculine, Protestant, financially secure. I held all of those positions of power. Then I understood how I was and exchanged all of that for authenticity. But instead of bringing that power with me in my authenticity, I was a traitor. I betrayed the men, because it's like, why would you give up? Why would you give up your power? But I also betrayed the women. You're not a real woman. you don't have the same experiences as a cisgender woman. And so I experienced this in both settings. But I've also found this, that within marginalization, transgender people's experience of marginalization is a lower caste than other people's experience of marginalization, because our experience is so new. Our experience of being the outsiders is so new. And so listening and speaking are very different things that trans communities can, members of the trans communities can do. And so I'm wanting to look to expand this conversation just a little bit, because when we talk about neurodivergence, there's a huge movement to cast neurodivergent people. And you mentioned it already with how the difference between you and your brother. You see, your brother was diagnosable, you weren't. Because his behavior was different than yours. And we see this with high functioning, low functioning language, as if there's a difference in the value of a human being.
You know, it's a little odd, because I wouldn't even necessarily say that my brother functioned differently than me so much as he already had the stigma of being a Black boy. So it's like, because I was always really hyper in school, but I was also a huge reader, right? So I would go from, which is one way that it shows up with Black women, is being hyper fixated on certain things. So I may be literally in the moment stimming and nobody even pays attention to me because I'm quiet. Like, I'm just here and I'm doing this, right? Whereas my brother would be the one to run around in circles. But if he ran around circles close enough to me, I would get up and start running around in circles with him, you know? So it's like stuff like that. But he definitely had the stigma of there are, like, I wish I had actually looked up the stats, but I know that it was a huge problem in the 80s with Black boys specifically being diagnosed with ADHD. And a lot of them did not actually even have the ADHD. It was just a stigma that was like, oh, like, they can't do this. It was essentially like, oh, well, you're different, you can't do this. So it was just a reason to push them into the corner. So it's a little bit different. But like with me, even, I feel like a lot of it, I have gnats. Okay. Like, I don't know. It's like, what's my line? Like, go the fuck away. But I think a lot of it too, with when you talk about like caste, like neurodivergence is one way that caste shows up, because there are so many people who aren't diagnosed that are neurodivergent. And part of it is because the science was always based on cisgendered heterosexual white men.
Yeah.
That was what the science was based on. And then when you think about the barriers that come with trying to get any kind of professional mental help, or like any kind of therapy, or seeing a psychologist, like a lot of those things aren't even available to people. Like, it's not something that is easily accessible, also because of caste.
Right.
So it's interesting because, like, yeah, to your point where it's like, okay, like, if you have someone who's like quote unquote high functioning, and then someone who may be quote unquote lower functioning, there is definitely a level of humanity that is placed. So yeah, so when you're talking about like even within that caste system, like there are castes within each caste, like that would be an example of that.
Yeah. And I mean, just, you know, general ADHD as a label back in the 80s and the 90s, it was like, okay, you're ADHD. We know you can't do well in school, so we're just going to move you through the system. When really there was no effort to actually understand who they were as a human being and how they could have succeeded. I mean, we're beginning to see the changes in that now, but wow, I mean, the idea of, you know, the caste system is right in front of us, and yet we just dismiss it as if this is how things are supposed to be.
That's part of the trick of it, though.
It is.
So
How do we change this? How do we change this? How do we make this different?
So, I am also an extreme realist. I don't know if it is something that can be changed, for the simple fact that I feel like the people who would really have the power to change it would need to be willing to give up their place in the caste system,
Mm-hmm.
which would require them to not be mediocre. And so it's like, so it's like at the end of the day, it's like, some of the success that we see that people have, where it's like, oh, look at them, like they have all this money, or look at them, like their family worked hard and they were able to do X, Y, and Z. Like a lot of that stuff is passed on, it's given, it's rewarded for where you were born within the caste system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even you think about like legacies that are accepted into like these really big schools, so like Harvard, the legacy admissions, Northwestern, the legacy admissions, like all of that. You have all of those things that are in existence, but here, shiny object, over here, affirmative action.
Right.
So there's no, and I say this to people and it's just like womp womp, but like literally there's not a short-term tangible benefit to the people who are at the top of at the caste system to dismantling the caste system. So I think what it really comes down to is that we have to be very cognizant within the caste systems that we are a part of and start dismantling some of the bullshit that we see within the caste that we are in, and
Right.
trying to kind of spread that down and knowing that like, okay, but this caste system exists. However, if we can start to break down some of these other things within our caste system, then I feel like there is a stronger possibility of there being a coalition that happens that can kind of just take power. And I don't know if it's gonna be pretty, but yeah, I think that there needs to be a certain level of unity between all of the lower caste in order to either scare higher classes enough that they give us a little bit more of the pie, because they're never going to give us the whole pie. They're just not. Or we can kind of start to chip away at it so that maybe 50, 60, 70 years from now, that caste does not have the same amount of power that it currently has. And at that point in time, something can be done. But
And,
there's no benefit to them dismantling it.
right. And I think we're seeing that reinforcing of caste by the elimination of DEI
Mm-hmm.
initiatives,
Mm-hmm.
because when those who are in power, and those who are wanting to eliminate DEI, what they hear is just updated terminology for affirmative action, which they never liked anyway. But diversity, equity, and inclusion, there is this understanding that it's about bringing everybody, into this and allowing everybody to be a part of the experience of it. So I think you're right. It's not going to happen anytime soon, especially with these monoliths who are just trying to knock down every effort to include everybody.
And I would also point this out, and I want people to be extremely aware of this when you start talking about things like DE and I, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even the language around dismantling DE&I programs and destroying that whole movement towards having more inclusive programming within certain areas and workplaces, the language with that became very binary. So it was
Mm-hmm.
black and white. It's for the black folk. That's it. It's for the black folk. It's the black people. And then you have, it's hurting the white people, right?
Yeah.
Um, so one thing that I wish people were a little more cognizant of, or at least paid attention to a little bit more, was if like when binaries are used, but a binary doesn't actually exist, you're being played with.
Yeah.
Because DE and I, like when I like one thing that I think about that I'm thankful that I had this experience when I was in college. Two of my really good friends were both paraplegics.
Mm-hmm.
And, prior to going into school, it was just kind of like, okay, I'm just running around the world and this is what I do, right? And then all of a sudden I have one of my friends that's paraplegic and it's like, hey, like I can't go to this place because they don't have curb cuts. So it's like really hard for me to get in. You're gonna have to lift up my wheelchair. So can you get somebody else to help so that we can lift up the wheelchair? Or, you know, like, damn, I just wish these elevators were a little bit wider because it's hard for me to get in here. Or this door isn't necessarily accessible for me. So certain things that I got to see with my own two eyes, and I relate that back like when DE and I started to get, because it's been around since the 70s, but when it really started to get talked about a lot more was right after everything that happened with George Floyd, which will always annoy the entire hell out of me because I feel like there was a good portion of the United States that was like, we didn't know racism was real, and then this happened. And it's like, okay, it didn't take any of the other 15 billion things that happened, but sure. But like, but it's like, you know, when people start talking about DE and I was on two committees. I was on the African American committee for one of my groups, and I was on the LGBTQ plus committee for one of my groups, for two different reasons that were kind of the same. But then I was also supportive of the disabled DE&I because I understood the good that it could do there, right? So then you have all of these different groups where, hey, these are the things that are specific to us that could help us. And 9 times out of 10, there would be very small changes that the company could do just to make somebody a little more successful, right? And then I see these programs being dismantled under the guise of black, white.
Right.
It's a game. It's
Yeah.
literally an emotional game. People's emotions are being played into, and they're ignoring the proof that they see right in front of them based on a knee-jerk emotional reaction to, well, we don't want them to have this, but it's not. Like, it's not us. It's not us. Every single time there's been any kind of progress within the United States of America through a civil rights movement that has mostly, I would really venture to say, every single time it was started by Black, brown, and indigenous people within the United States, it has benefited every single person that has been marginalized within the United States. And yet the play is, don't let the Black folk have it, and then it ends up hurting everyone.
Yeah. And you know, the talking point that, you know, I'm hearing, and it's even made its way into the campaign this year, is rights are not a pie. I mean, it's not like taking something away from, or giving something to someone is taking away from another person.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also some sensitivity on the part of marginalized communities, and there's some siloing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in between the marginalized communities, because when we do talk about civil rights, there are those within groups who do push back and say, well, I can't support your cause because my cause, you know, ... I've been guilty of it myself, you know, fighting for trans people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've heard, you know, indigenous people constantly reminding me, and I don't mean this in a negative way. I mean this, I need this as the reminder, but they constantly speak to me about, you are not holding space for indigenous rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I take that and I'm like, shit, they're right. How do we deal with that?
I think we deal with that by recognizing that intersectionality is very real.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons why I feel like I am a lot more vocal about LGBT plus rights, like one of the reasons why I am so vocal about that and why I will argue down people that I know when they say certain things, is because if Black lives matter, we have to recognize the fact that all Black lives matter.
Mm-hmm.
Black trans people have worse outcomes in this country than other trans people. So we need to hold space for that. And if we hold space for their existence and we hold space for them having a right to exist as a human being, then we need to hold space for everybody else having that exact same right. When you talk about like indigenous people and they're like, you don't hold space for indigenous rights. I feel like, again, recognizing that intersectionality, right? Whereas, like, yes, you're a trans woman. However, there are trans women who are indigenous, and you can hold space for their rights as well as you speak about yours. And knowing that those two things are very closely intertwined and very closely interconnected. And that is the coalition building. That is
Right.
it. There is understanding that, like, these things still relate to each other all the way across the board. So even within my marginalization, right? So it's like, I am a Black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And even within that marginalization, I can hold space for all these other marginalizations, because at the end of the day, we're all fighting the same thing. We're
Yeah.
literally fighting the same thing.
Yeah. And sometimes my language doesn't clarify that, because sometimes I do get up in my space, and I just use my group as the focal point. But you know, you speak to, this thing that we share, this thing that ties us together, and in a system where, I mean, people are actively finding these pigeonholes of where we belong in their eye. How have you taken care of yourself in all of that? Because you are fucking amazing.
Aw, thank you.
And you bring positivity, and I'm not gonna lie, hon. There are some days when you're just too damn positive for me, even, and it's like, I can take a lot, but how do you take care of yourself to get to that place of positivity?
So I think it's honestly very selfish. So me trying to be positive about things, when I bring people in, so like when I do my lives and I do like my positivity live, right? And it's like, hey, I want to celebrate you. I get a rush from that. So that
Yeah.
actually is taking care of me, because I get a rush from that. I get a rush from people being like, man, I had a really bad day, or I had a really bad week, and now I feel better. I selfishly get a rush from that. It makes me
Mm-hmm.
happy. It puts me into a different headspace. I tell people all the time I have an unhealthy level of apathy. And I don't think that people believe me when I say that, but I have an unhealthy level of apathy. So there are, like, I feel like I've almost trained my brain in certain ways where it's like, yeah, of course this dumb shit would happen. Anyways, moving on. Like, it's like, I can't dwell on certain things, and then in every single situation I try to find some piece of control that I have in it,
Mm-hmm.
because that makes me feel like at least I had a choice, right? So
Yeah.
if something happens and it's like, I don't know how to respond to this, or I don't know what's going to happen next, I can at least know that I get to choose what my response to that is. And me having that control makes me feel a little more empowered. If I decide to fold, if somebody says something stupid as shit to me and
Mm-hmm.
I decide to fold, I will have a quick conversation with myself where it's like, okay, but why did you decide to fold? Well, you had this, and this happen, and you were afraid of this happening. And it's like, yeah, so you folded because of fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to fold sometimes, because that's very human. It is human to be afraid. It
Yeah.
is human to not want the bad things to happen to you. It is also human to get fed up with it and tell everybody to kiss your entire ass. Those
Yeah.
things are very human. So I think for me, the strongest things that I have ever done in my entire life that help me cope in general is
Mm-hmm.
being able to forgive myself very easily for certain things, and being
Mm-hmm.
able to recognize where my humanity is flawed, and knowing that that is absolutely okay. And then moving on from there. I do not believe in perfection. I do not need to be perfect. Um, and I just kind of, I move with that. I literally try to move with that energy. And when it comes down to being positive, it's like, I guess it's like a little bit of the scientist in me, because neuroplasticity definitely is a real thing. So a little bit of the science in me where it's like, no, like, you can reframe this and trick your brain. But I mean, for the most part, it's the apathy. I just don't give a shit.
Right. Fair enough. And that is something that you say, not that not, I don't give a shit. But the part about neuroplasticity,
Mm-hmm.
and you really do believe in that.
Mm-hmm.
You actually have been intentional in some of your rewiring. So could you share a little bit about your experience with that?
Oh man. So when I was a wee child, like I got bullied very, very badly. Up until probably my sophomore year of high school, I got bullied horribly. I Part of the reason why I was diagnosed with chronic depression when I was 16 was because I tried to commit suicide. And my parents freaked out and they got me into therapy, and I'm very thankful for the fact that they did that. But very, very depressed. I've always been, I don't want to call it moody, but like observant of humanity to the point that it made me sad because I just saw people for what they were, right? um and I feel like at some point during all of this, when I was on meds, and it's so random, but when I was on meds, it kind of calmed me. I don't even want to say it calmed me down. It just made my brain stop cycling through the thoughts to the point that I was like, wait a minute, I don't want to think about this anymore. And I just stopped. And every time I started to think about something, it would just be like, yeah, but this is actually good. So, yeah, but like this is actually working out for you. Like, yeah, like this little boy doesn't like you, but your dad loves you. Like it was like shit like that where I just started practicing it when I was in high school, probably. I really just started doing it on my own. And then later on in life, when people started talking about it, and it's like you find out about it, I'm like, oh, I already do this because there's so many things that have happened to me that have been extremely traumatic, honestly, that it's like this thing happened and yet I still have to get up and try to move. There is someone who is dependent on me. There's somebody that needs me to lean on. So it's like I would just kind of reframe things to the point that it became habit for me to reframe things and then deal with it when I could deal with it, which I'm not saying that that is the healthy way of dealing with it. That is my way of dealing with it. But I mean, it's funny because I do feel like I definitely have times where I genuinely am just very happy and very much like, hey, I want to be in this positive space with other people and just kind of keep it going because there's too much bullshit. Like everybody has bullshit that they're dealing with, which is part of the issue with all of the bad things that happen with humanity is because everybody is hurting. So, like, can we redirect that pain somewhere else or redirect it into something else that winds up helping other people, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. What about drawing support from others? How have you been, how have you been connected with others where they have been able to kind of help nurture you along and help you develop, whether it is in, increasing your positivity or, helping embrace your, experience of ADHD or any of these other areas? How have you kind of connected with others and drawn support from them?
My friends are freaking everything. Like they're literally everything. My best friends, I have known them since high school. They have been with me and seen me at my lowest. They've seen me at my highs. They know that I kind of have a tendency to just yo sometimes. Like they're totally fine with it. And I think that the best thing that my friends have ever done, um, they call me out on my shit. So like so like I remember one of my exes, my ex actually broke up with me a week after we got back from New Orleans. We went to New Orleans and I cooked him like this amazing dinner. The food was good. That ain't why he broke up with me. The food was good. But like I made like this amazing dinner, right? And he broke up, like he ate the dinner and was like making sounds like, "Oh my god, this is so good. This is so good." Broke up with me after the dinner. And
No!
piece of shit, okay? But anyway, so, so like he breaks up with me after dinner and I like fell apart. Like I call my best friend and I'm like, I can't believe right? Like ugly crying, right?
Yeah.
My girls come over to my house, like all of them. It was like all of my high school babies. I call them my high school babies. It's like 4 of them. They all come over to my house, just like leave the door unlocked. We're coming over. I leave the door unlocked. I'm in the bed crying. They come upstairs and are sitting around me. And one of my friends was just like, I mean, yeah, I love you. And this is rough, but you literally were talking to us about 2 weeks ago about how you wanted to break up with him because he was getting on your nerves. And I was like, good point. I was just like, oh my God. I'm like, wait. And he has like microphallus too. Like, what the fuck am I crying about? Like, when I tell you I cried about that shit for like a total of 6 hours. And then was like just snap back to reality with that one fucking comment. And I was just like, oh my God. I'm like, what the hell? Like, the dick was bad, everything. Like, what the fuck am I doing right now? Like, why are you crying, girls? Like, what are you doing? It was like literally 6 hours of despair and then reality.
Riding that despair bus right into a wall is
right
is
into
shock.
a wall. Right into a wall. And that is what my friends do for me. My friends keep me grounded because they like, my love language is literally based in logic, right? Like, somebody can logic me out of anything. And my friends, because we are so just like direct with each other, because we know we love each other so much that we can have those hard conversations and none of it is ever an attack.
Right.
They support me in those ways because they will literally just like, hey, homegirl, like, the fuck? It's like, what are you doing? What are you doing, babe?
Right.
What are you doing? And I'm like, okay, fair, you know?
And there is no accountability like the insider accountability. You know, that they know you, they know exactly where your short circuit switch is to get you to hiccup. And all of a sudden it's like, damn it. And AJ, Angela, who is head of Umbrella, is that way with me. And it, you know, very similar. You know, I keep coming back to her even though she puts my shit in front of my face. And sometimes that's what we need. But you also have joy with those friends too. I mean, it's not just accountability, because you were telling me about you cook a meal for them.
Oh yeah. So every year, for Christmas, every year since we graduated from college, because when we first graduated, it was me and my best friend. We were the only two that were still left in the area. Everybody else moved to different states. So Christmas, everyone would come home. And I started doing a Christmas brunch the year after we graduated, where I would cook brunch for all of my friends. We'd have drinks. They come over at like 9 o'clock, come over to the house, and we don't leave until 6 o'clock, and we get like way too wasted, but it's fun. And then it's like everybody has to sober up, so they just end up staying over at the house, and we watch YouTube videos and talk shenanigans about like, did you hear about what happened to this girl from high school? Like, no, Phil. Like, we do all of that shit. And we've been doing it. So I graduated when I was, how old was I? I don't even remember how old I was. I was like 23. It was like 22. No, I think it was 22 when I graduated. And so we've been doing it. This year would be the 20th year that I've done it.
Wow. That is so awesome.
Yeah. Those are my babes. Like, those are, I will disappear someone for them.
There you go. And that's, I think we all need people that we will disappear people for them.
Absolutely. Because science don't get caught.
Nzinga, it has truly been a joy. I am so grateful for you to be a part of this conversation and to share so much of your wisdom, because, you know, I always like to say, wisdom is just knowledge that's got a lot of trauma. You bring a lot of that wisdom that you've learned, and thank you for teaching and educating me. that's been very helpful.
Thank you, Janie. Thank you. And keep it up. Like, I'm always in awe of how much stamina you have, because you are very much fighting the good fight. So keep that up and just be kind to yourself.
Keeping the good fight's easier sometimes than being good and kind to myself. But thank you. I will. And that's it for this episode of Indie and O. We want to thank you for being a part of that. AJ, will you take us out?